for 2 or 3 years, the entire future of our democratic civilization, all of it, the whole concept of human rights, rested on the shoulders of those two men. And we were fortunate to have them. But no, as Americans, I agree, Roosevelt and Reagan, yes. As Sam Rayburn said in his recollections of his career, Roosevelt was basically a dictator, but he was so good at it, and what he did was so positive, we didn't notice until we thought about it after he died. Reagan, he cut taxes, inflation, which was in double digits when he came in, declined, and I think he deserves credit for welfare reform too. The judgment and the character to be as little devious and as little severe as necessary, and to pursue objectively admirable goals and succeed at it. If you can get all that in a reasonable measure, I think you've got a fine statesman.
Thanks for joining me, Conrad.
Oh, my pleasure, Johnny. Thank you for the invitation. It's lovely to be back in Wilmington.
Yeah, it's great. It's great to have you here, and you're a very fitting guest as we move towards the conclusion of this series on statesmanship. You've written 3 biographies of, maybe more than that, but at least 3 biographies of great American presidents,
yes.
FDR, Nixon, and Donald Trump. And then you are in the process of writing a 3-part strategic and political history of the world.
That sounds absurd, but it's happening.
Yeah, it's. I admire you are daring greatly in your pursuit.
It's my magnum opus, you're saying. That's why I'm, at my age, working so hard to finish it.
That's right.
I'm almost finished the 2nd volume, so I'm just coming up to the American Revolution.
Okay, fantastic. So in your reflections on political leadership, ancient and modern, how would you define statesmanship?
Well, my definition would be a combination of, I'm improvising this. I've never been asked the question before, so if I'm slightly syncopated, be patient with me. But a combination of the cunning to get the high office and hold it, and if necessary, the ruthlessness to maintain yourself. But the judgment and the character to be as little devious and as little severe as necessary, and to pursue objectively admirable goals and succeed at it. I mean, if you can get all that in a reasonable measure, I think you've got a fine statesman.
I think that's a more succinct definition than, and also a way to kind of synthesize the advice you might see in Machiavelli from the advice you might get from someone like a Cicero. I want to start in the ancient world. So at the beginning of your book...
See, Cicero, not to interrupt you, but he was a theorist, and he wasn't very effective politically. He was offered a membership in the first triumvirate, so it'd be a quadrumvirate, and he refused it. And he was associated. He had nothing to do with it directly, but he knew about the assassination of Caesar, and he welcomed it. Now, that was an unworthy act, and it was a terrible mistake, because Caesar's successor, Octavian Caesar, never forgave him, and he did away with him as a result of it. Sorry, I interrupted you.
Cut his tongue off. Yeah.
No, I think he had him stabbed.
Yeah. Okay. But then later, I think he was beheaded.
You mean after? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they did that in those days. They did terrible things with the heads of. I mean, even Oliver Cromwell's head was on a pike for 20 years.
20 years.
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't realize. So, all right, I do want to get to Caesar, but before that, let's say looking at ancient Egypt, go out through Mesopotamia, China, India, the pagan world, setting aside the Jews, which we'll talk about in a moment. How did they understand statesmanship and political leadership? Was it different from what you described?
No, it was a simpler thing. We're talking about bands becoming clans, and clans becoming tribes, and tribes becoming actual jurisdictions, ceasing to be nomadic, and building a capital and deciding who they're, not that the concept of citizenship existed exactly, but who it was that was within their realm, you see. And then they built up a kind of a monarchy. And from early times, you had a friction between the leader and the high priest, you see, because it's always been in the human consciousness to wonder about the spiritual values and what's beyond and how things started and how they'll end and that sort of thing. And if skillful leaders managed to combine the two, like King David did, for example, or in more recent times, Henry VIII. Now, the way Henry VIII did it was a bit much, but he did it. And so this gradually these entities became more sophisticated, and in the period you described, you went from really just clans in Mesopotamia muddling around, making war on each other, to the Greek city-states, some of which were quite sophisticated politically, as everybody knows, and then Rome, which for 600 years had this vast empire. It was a republic for a long time, and then an empire that embraced the entire Mediterranean, a large part of the Middle East, and then into Europe, all the way to the border of England and Scotland. An astonishing achievement, I may say, for the beginning of the Christian era.
And so, I'm clearly, like you, I'm a big fan of Rome, so I really want to get there. But first, so the ancient Israelites, how would you describe, or how do you describe in your book, their conception of the political order, and how does that contrast from some of the other pagan political societies at the time?
They were the originators of monotheism, and that was a great advantage. I mean, I'm leaving out whatever anyone's religious views might be, because if you think of it, they're contemporaries. If you moved 50 miles from one town to another, you have to get a completely new set of gods, and there's a god for every function. There's a god for the sun and the moon, and sailing and war making, and all kinds of things, and it really isn't sensible, and it was very vulnerable in comparison to someone saying there is only one God and it's for everybody. And then of course the Christians embellished on that with the concept that God's only son came among us, and we humans killed him, you say. So that was a powerful message, and of course it became, not to be crass, but the big brand, And incidentally, my own view, and I express it very politely, is that to some degree Islam was emulating the success of Christianity, but they just claimed a prophet. They couldn't claim the Son of God, you see. But the Archangel Gabriel made the announcement in both cases, of the birth of Jesus and of the prophet. But I mean, so it's alleged. But gradually these functions became more sophisticated, and early on you had leaders who just led their men around in wars and things and lived well, and sometimes they were succeeded by their sons and sometimes not. But eventually political processes developed with the succession process. Now, often it broke down. I mean, most of the Roman emperors died violently. It wasn't, the Roman Empire was not a time of great serenity other than in the imperial peace of the 2nd century and the Augustan era prior to that. But life in the Roman Empire was safe and secure and well organized. But at the top, there was a lot of turmoil.
Sure. To speak in crude terms, was monotheism an asset or a liability when it comes to empire? I mean, if you think of Alexander the Great or Cyrus the Great, right, there's a way in which they can very easily conquer territories, and then whether it's in Babylon or whether it's somewhere else in the Near East, you can go to the temples of the local gods, you can marry the women, you can just syncretize sort of the customs.
You're giving a perfect verbal handbook on the methodology of conquest in those days. I mean, Alexander's wife, Roxanne, was the daughter of the king of what is now Afghanistan. It was called Bactria in those days. the better Persian rulers were very careful of the local religions and treated their religious temples with great respect, you say. Others were not so respectful, but they were, and Alexander the Great was fine that way too. But his mission was to Hellenize, even though he was a Macedonian. He wanted to blend the Greek culture with the apparatus of the Persian Empire. It was a very grand vision he had, but of course he died in his 30s and he couldn't get it all done. But there you have, of course, as his the title implies, an exceptionally talented and distinguished leader. For the most part, they were a job lot. Sometimes they were respectful of other views and sometimes not. I just like to add one thing about the Jews. The early Jewish religion held that the divine being, Jehovah, actually entered the mind of living people. And at times was in fact governing. Now, this is a flourish that I don't think any other religion has bought into. That someone like you or I, we are who we are. However, Yahweh comes and settles within our minds. We have the judgment and the intelligence of the deity. That was, for example, said of Saul. The so-called kingdom of Israel was really just Saul, David, and Solomon, and then it fragmented after that. But they had this idea that they were so intimately connected to the one God that the one God at times just took over the physical person of the king and governed for the Jews.
In a way that would be different from, say, you go into a pagan temple to a certain to Bacchus and you offer sacrifices and you get intoxicated and the spirit of Bacchus animates your behavior. This is obviously it's Yahweh, I believe, is the one true God. So this is, but
look, if somebody can actually sit there and say and apparently believe it and have other people believe it, that what he is saying is in fact the word of God. If you believe it, it's pretty impressive.
It is. And I guess that you could say that the work of demonic forces is always to kind of imitate what God is trying to do in the world, but to do
a leader of the opposition.
Yeah, leader of the opposition. So let's talk about Rome. The Cicero kind of Caesar debate has been one that's come up in many of our discussions so far. I guess, first of all, the transition from the Roman Empire to the Roman Republic, is that a real transition, or was the Republic an empire?
It was a kingdom, and then a republic, and then the empire.
Republic, empire. Were they all imperial in nature in the sense of their conquest?
But the kingdom just extended across the width of Italy and up and down a little bit, but it didn't. It wasn't. It was given that Rome started as a little market town, a kind of miniature Fresno, California, where people bring in their harvests and things. The kingdom did well to extend from the Mediterranean to the Adriatic and halfway down to Naples and halfway up to Genoa. Approximately that's what it was. And then the Republic went far beyond that. Caesar conquered Gaul. They took over Spain in the Punic Wars. They took over Greece right after right after the Second Punic War, and the Near East too. They were, and at the time of the Third Punic War, they took over most of the Mediterranean coast of Africa. So it was large before the empire began. The kings were thrown out because they were corrupt and despotic. So they set up a republic, and the republic did well, as it did. It was good government by the standards of the time, and the Romans developed these techniques for expansion. What they would do is they would figure out that an area was desirable to control, either for its resources or as a defensive measure to protect Rome. And then they would invade it, and then they would lower the taxes and improve security for people. So the robberies, and they'd build roads and bring them into a common market with what they already controlled. So quite quickly, these people, on the one hand, as nationalists, they resented the presence of the Romans, but on the other hand, their standard of living went up, and their sense of personal security went up. And then those who collaborated with the Romans, they would bring into the Senate, you see, and treat them as great figures in the whole empire. And it was a technique to some extent the British emulated many centuries later. But it was very original at that time, and it was, of course, very successful. But where the Republic came to grief was when the Gracchus brothers, who were grandchildren of Publius Scipio, won the Second Punic War against Hannibal, a great Roman family. They were like the liberal scions of great American families, like the Roosevelts and the Rockefellers. They were kind of reformers, you see, even though they were rich. And they were murdered, both of them. Okay. And at that point, the Senate forfeited the trust of the whole jurisdiction. And what happened was, whenever crises arose, the Romans had to call upon a general to stabilize things. And you had the sequence, and they were all great generals: Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar. And Caesar, in a way, unified everything, because he was Marius's nephew, and at one point he was Sulla's grandson-in-law. And he was at one time Pompey's father-in-law. And of course, Augustus, who followed him, was his grandnephew and his adopted son. But so there was some continuity. But this meant that, in effect, Marius, the first of them, the Roman Senate sent the Roman armies to the north to defend Italy against the Teutons, and the Teutons defeated them. They sent these consuls up who had no more idea of how to command an army than you and I do of how to build a rocket ship, and so Rome has no army at this point. So they, the pattern is you call upon your best general, never mind that he's a consular now, and say, you've got a blank check, go and save us, you say. So Marius did. I mean, he routed the Teutons. He scored dramatic victories militarily. But his soldiers' loyalty was to him, not to the Roman Senate. So he came back, and he was elected consul 7 times, but he got the Senate to vote, veterans' benefits for his men. You see, but so he was really the power, and Sulla became a dictator. Pompey was more benign and gentle, but he had immense authority. These men rendered great service as generals, you see. And then Caesar, they proclaimed him a dictator. That's why I take objection to the Shakespeare or Cicero theory that he was a tyrant. They kept piling these honors on Caesar that he never asked for. And in any case, murdering a man as talented as that, who'd rendered such service to Rome, was a terrible crime.
So before we get to the case for Caesar, what were, from Cicero's perspective, what were the classical Roman Republican virtues that he was trying to?
Yeah, he and Cato too, even more so. Well, Cicero liked the good life. He wasn't an ascetic like both Catos were. He was a very successful lawyer, so he lived well. And he was the consul. His great achievement was in the Catiline conspiracy. He saw him off, which was a service, no doubt. But his political judgment wasn't great. He thought that he had a Mephistophelian influence on Pompey, which he didn't. And he acknowledged Caesar's talents. But he was kind of jealous of him, and so he's sort of hostile. But Caesar was the winning ticket. If you're a good politician, you support the winner, And he helped badger Pompey into his quarrel with Caesar, which need not have happened. And what they did to Caesar was unreasonable. They claimed the right to indict him for exceeding his authority. And he exceeded his authority by conquering Gaul, France, for Italy. It was a colossal service he rendered.
Yeah.
And one of history's great military campaigns. I mean, with 10 legions, he conquered all of Gaul. And it so improved the lot of the people living there that they became rather loyal Romans. And in addition, he made it clear that it's either us or you're going to have the Germans attacking you all the time. And so it was a great quest for Rome. And he said, look, I'll come back to Rome if I can run for consul again. And they said, no, you have to disband your army, take leave of your army, and come back, and you can't run for consul for a time, meaning they were going to arrest him and charge him. So he said, you think I'm going back to that? Are you crazy? And, he returned to Rome and announced that he was the authority in Rome.
And the people, the common man,
the people were with him. 100%. Yeah, they were with him. And when he was assassinated, poor old Cassius went charging out with 2 bloody knives in his hand. There was a sporting event taking place right next to the Senate. He said, we've killed the tyrant, and so on. And he thought he'd be applauded, you say, and he wasn't. And the Roman masses made it very clear right from the start that they didn't approve of the murder of Caesar. And at Caesar's famous funeral, one little publicized fact, Caesar had been quite generous to the Jews. He thought they were talented people and he liked dealing with them. Generous to them in Rome and generous to them in Israel, Judea. And at his funeral, the Jews came out in strength to honor him, and they sang the Kaddish and so on. It made quite an impression.
Okay.
And Mark Antony's funeral address, which I always assumed was made up by Shakespeare, it wasn't. That's actually what he said. And Cicero recorded it, and Plutarch found it in Cicero's archives. And Shakespeare got it from there. Mark Antony wasn't a great orator, but that was a great speech and very effective one.
So what
I'm
would
digressing
you say, I guess the program of Caesarism, that Augustus kind of implemented in the wake of Julius Caesar's assassination.
Well,
what was the
Augustus made it up as he went along, but Caesar, went and had his famous affair with Cleopatra and so on, and he'd been through the Gallic War and the Civil War with Pompey, and he just wanted to have a nice holiday and roust about, and he did. And in Rome, people were saying, "Well, what's Caesar going to do?" You say, "And what's he going to do?" And he said, "Well, I'll go back in a while and we'll work it out." And they really became so nervous about him, they killed him. Not because he did anything oppressive, and we don't know what he was going to do. He denied that he had any ambition to be a monarch. And at one point, Mark Antony offered him a crown. He said, "No, you don't. I'm a Republican."
Is that just a tactical move, like transform the system without?
I don't think so.
No.
I think he was a sincere Republican.
Okay.
But I think they all thought that after the murder of the Gracchi, the Republic wasn't working. I mean, the Gracchi wanted to take parts of the empire and relocate voluntarily. Rome had a population of 1 million people by now, but most of them were very poor, you see. We wanted to relocate these people all around so that people had some land of their own, and Rome itself was not dominated by mobs the way it was often. And other than when a general arrived with his own army, then obviously he dominated. But in the case of Augustus, he worked. He faithfully claimed to be a loyal member of the Senate. He was the president of the Senate. He was elected consul 14 times, and he ultimately accumulated offices. But he waited until the others gave it to him and insisted he take them. Often this was orchestrated by him, of course. It's like Roosevelt running for a third term. It was a draft, except it was an organized in advance.
Yeah.
And so he became the Pontifex Maximus. He ran the Roman religion. He became the commander of the army, as well as president of the Senate. He had this title, Father of the People. and he had all the power, but he always would come to the Senate and speak deferentially about the Senate and the powers of the Senate. And they just went through this charade that it was some kind of a collegial operation, but it wasn't. It was him, but very cleverly managed. See, many statesmen in different eras, you find this phenomenon that they're very talented and the jurisdiction they're running does very well while they're there. Like Richelieu and Bismarck, for example, are two of the greatest statesmen in the history of Europe. But everything went to pieces, not right after Richelieu, but a little while after. And everything went to pieces in Germany, basically starting right after Bismarck was removed.
And this is a common theme, obviously, even you see the story of in Xenophon's portrait of Cyrus the Great, right?
Yeah.
Remarkable peace, prosperity, empire's glorious. And then, you thought he taught everything to his sons, but like within basically hours of his death and his blessings, things descended to chaos. I think you could, I guess we could maybe transition to America. I'm going to say something about FDR, but then we'll go to the founders. You could even say with FDR, he had 4 terms. He was sort of like an American Augustus, but then after his death, right, sort of all that authority was just sort of lodged in the bureaucrocy, and there wasn't really a clear
and it went back to the Constitution. At the end, I just to illustrate your point, in one of the people I interviewed for that book, and I knew her socially quite well anyway, was Mr. Churchill's daughter, Lady Soames, Mary Soames, and she told me that her father had said that he had never in all of his career been so envious of anyone as when they were parting at the Atlantic Conference in Newfoundland in 1941. The United States was not in the war. Their ships came into the harbor there and they met on shipboard. And so when Churchill was leaving, he said, well, look, you give me the time to get home and I will speak to the king and I will have to speak to the party leaders in our coalition and I'll have to speak with the prime ministers of the dominions, Canada and Australia and so on. It won't take long. I'll get through it quickly. There's no problem. It'll all be done, but I've got to watch the protocol here. And then Churchill said, and Roosevelt nodded, you say, and then Churchill said, and I imagine you have a bit of consulting to do too. And Roosevelt said, well, in our system, I'm the chief of state. I'm the head of the government. I'm the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. My party controls both houses of the Congress, and I've appointed most of the members of the Supreme Court. And as long as I don't violate the Constitution, which I won't do, I don't really do a lot of consulting. And he didn't. But it's a very apt, and I had not thought of it before, comparison with Augustus, because he had this suave patrician manner and was a very charming man and was always very deferential to the leaders of the Congress. But as Sam Rayburn said in his recollections of his career, Roosevelt was basically a dictator, but he was so good at it, and what he did was so positive, we didn't notice until we thought about it after he died.
Fascinating. So the American founders, who you have obviously great respect for, they looked to, they were familiar with, Plutarch's Lives. But they looked to Cicero and to Cato more than they did to Caesar or Alexander. I mean,
Yes.
So
Alexander, they didn't really have a relationship culturally. He's a Macedonian, and he was a kind of one-off, And of course,
but they probably would have read.
But they would have admired him as a great general and a phenomenon because, after he died, you had these wars of the Diadochi, the successors, and they went on for more than 50 years, and everything was torn down, and they were back down to a Macedonia smaller than what Alexander's father, Philip, had. And in the end, Alexander the Great's mother and his wife and his infant child were all murdered. So the succession to Alexander was a disaster, 50 years of war. So, I think there's a bit of a firewall between him. Everyone admires his talents, but between him and in terms of political continuity, anyone that came after, they knew the Romans better than the Greeks, but I think that's because of the Republican tradition.
They were drawn to that Republican tradition. What did our founders see in that Republican tradition that they preferred over the Caesarism of Augustus. Obviously, they saw George III as a tyrant, right? And they were trying to restore sort of a modern day incarnation.
Well,
of
this
a
is
Roman
it. They
Republic.
chinned themselves on the theory that George III was a tyrant.
Sure.
And, if you read the Declaration of Independence, I mean, Jefferson's indictment of poor old George III sounds like it's from the Nuremberg trials or something, how he tried to destroy America and kill Americans and so forth, import Catholicism into George III was no lover of the Pope, believe me. It was a beautiful intro and a beautiful tale on the Declaration of Independence, but much of the arraignment of the British king in the middle of it is really outrageous. It's very unjust. I'm no great apologist for George III.
Sure,
He wasn't the greatest king, but he wasn't a bad man. He didn't get it. You see, they fought this war largely because the Americans wanted them to throw the French out of Canada.
Mm-hmm.
They tripled their national debt. And then they set out to impose taxes to pay for it. And they asked the Americans, as the richest British people in the world, and highest standard of living, since they'd got rid of the French to please them, they wanted them to pay the tax the English and Scottish were already paying. But then the Americans devised this theory of no taxation without representation. It's like a guy having a drink in the bar. He drinks the drink. And the guy presents the bill, and he said, "Wait a minute, what drink?"
So this is the British Canadian perspective.
No, I'm not a whitewasher of the British.
Sure.
They terribly mishandled that, and the cleverer British, like Edmund Burke, for example, and even up to a point, Dr. Johnson saw that they were mismanaging it. But you're right. The United States, the Americans, in order to develop a reason for the rather radical step they were taking, couldn't just say, "Look, we want a government in our own geographic territory, and what the hell do we need the British for?"
Yeah.
So they built up an ethos, and I don't mean that disrespectfully.
Sure.
But part of it was, we don't want a monarch.
Mm-hmm.
We want an elected leader. Therefore, we want a republic.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want this country ruled by the people who were fortunate in who their ancestors were. We wanted a meritocracy, and that is that and the constitutional stability are the basic keys to the completely unprecedented growth of this country from 3 million people on the Atlantic shore in 2 long lifetimes to the end of World War II, to having half the economic product of the world. That was a war-ravaged world, but half of the production of the world was in the United States in 1945. And they had an atomic monopoly. I mean, it was only 160 years, for Yorktown to the end of World War II. An astounding thing. And for more than a century, the United States has operated on a scale that the world never imagined to be possible. When Roosevelt went out and gave his statement shortly after Pearl Harbor about what war production was going to be, 100,000 aircraft and things like this per year, nobody could believe it. And Churchill couldn't believe it. Certainly Hitler didn't believe it. It's nonsense. They can't do that.
Propaganda, yeah.
But he exceeded all the targets. The country exceeded all the targets. So my point is that they, in order to justify what they were doing, they wanted to make it clear they were instituting a new form of government, or going back to an old form, but doing it better. Mm-hmm. This would be a republic, but it would be a genuine democracy. And I don't know, it has been.
Yeah.
I mean, it has its imperfections, but no one can say it hasn't been astoundingly successful as a country.
So moving to the 20th century, the two most significant statesmen of the 20th century are Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan.
Winston Churchill, I think.
Oh, sorry, of American statesmen.
Yes.
Yes. And we had...
you're certainly right. We had Roosevelt and Reagan. Yeah.
Andrew Roberts joined me for an episode on Churchill. So we got a lot of Churchill in.
I just say that, 2 or 3 years, the entire future of our democratic civilization, all of it, the whole concept of human rights, rested on the shoulders of those two men. And we were fortunate to have them. But no, as Americans, I agree, Roosevelt and Reagan, yes.
Yeah. So looking at these, I'm wondering if you can, briefly make and I think this is, I think when conservatives, even the conservative movement in large part began in America as a reaction against the New Deal. So
yes, I agree.
So largely,
and some parts of the New Deal were rubbish. Parts of Roosevelt himself knew that. I mean, he didn't care when they threw out the National Industrial Recovery Act. He just didn't want the court shutting down the Tennessee Valley and stuff like that. Sorry.
So I'm just curious. Conservatives typically look at this as Reagan's the good guy. FDR's the bad guy. Today, we're still dealing with the legacy of the New Deal and trying to claw back the administrative state, which is really metastasized. But I'm wondering if you could make the case briefly for both FDR and Reagan as
no
the
problem doing
statesman.
It. And I may say that Reagan himself, the first election in which he voted was the one that President Roosevelt's first election as president. And he was a loyal Roosevelt supporter all through Roosevelt's 4 terms. This is what I say to my conservative friends in the U.S., and I'm relatively conservative.
Sure.
First of all, he came into office, the unemployment rate was over 30%, and there was no federal assistance for them. For the day he was inaugurated, there were machine gun nests at the corners of the great federal buildings in Washington for the first time since the Civil War. The country, the economic system had collapsed. The banks were closed in 48 states. All of the stock and commodity exchanges had closed. All of them. They weren't functioning. And they closed sine die. I mean, the system was absolutely in a desperate condition. And you had to, there was no alternative but to do some of the things he did. So he intervened to support farm prices, to refinance people's mortgages, and to stabilize the banking system and reopen it, and to provide public works to put people back to work. He was no enthusiast of the dole. I think that what the conservatives are really railing against, and I agree with them, are aspects of the Great Society. And I admired LBJ in many ways, and he was a wonderful president for civil rights. Wasn't a good war leader, unfortunately, but he was a great president for civil rights, and of course a tremendous figure in the history of the U.S. Congress. But Roosevelt said things like, no one ever dies of famine in this country in the summer, so we're going to cut benefits in the summer. And he said, I'm not paying people to be idle unless they literally can't work. We're not going to have people starving because they're unwell. But anyone who can work, we're going to put them to work. They could go and save the whooping crane, or study under Eugene O'Neill how to write plays, or they can help us build highways or national parks, plant trees, and make sure there are lots of fish and lakes. They had all these programs, and they built an astounding, the Triborough Bridge in New York, and the state capitol in Helena, Montana, and the inland waterway. I mean, all kinds of things. Tennessee Valley Authority. And as war threatened, of course, the numbers of these people in these projects, workfare, you'd call it now, declined. I mean, the normal economy started to revive and, re-employ people in increasing numbers. But those that were still there in the late 30s were working in defense production. I mean, the famous aircraft carriers, the Enterprise and the Wasp, for example, became very famous at Midway. They were largely built by unemployed men under supervision of naval architects, and that was how he thought. He wanted to balance the budget, and he sincerely meant it when he told Felix Frankfurter, "I'm the greatest friend American capitalism ever had. I've saved 95% of that system." And all of it was in danger when I came in. And I think I always say to our conservative friends, they're making a mistake letting the Democrats, obviously FDR was a Democrat, just as TR was a Republican, but letting the Democrats kidnap FDR for the left because he wasn't, in present terms, a leftist.
What do you think would have happened? So in your reading, if there was no New Deal, right, if he didn't, in your view, kind of save capitalism, what would have been the outcome? I mean, he feared a socialism or something more aggressive.
Well, he used to say that the most dangerous people in the country were Douglas MacArthur, even though he thought he was a good general and promoted him as a general. Douglas MacArthur, Huey Long, demagogic governor of Louisiana, William Randolph Hearst, and Colonel McCormick. I mean, they operated their newspapers in a seriously irresponsible way at times. And but what he feared is that if he couldn't restore an adequate level of confidence in the agrarian and working classes of this country, there would be a danger of a revolution, just a violent outburst of not well directed, just like the French Revolution. Everyone just tears everything down, kills people, and there's no point to any of it, and I mean, obviously you'd have to get things in a terrible condition for that to happen. And I think that what you'd get is a large version of Hoover's dealing with the bonus army, where MacArthur, with Eisenhower and Patton on his staff, and Eisenhower saying, "I wouldn't use too much force, General," and Patton saying, "General, we should mow them down." Different views of it all. But I think you could have had large episodes of violence and use of the military or special police to suppress it, which is not the sort of thing you want in this country. I mean, we're accustomed to seeing it, unfortunately, in a lot of other countries, but not an advanced, rich country like this.
So then fast forwarding to Ronald Reagan, you have after the New Deal, you have the Great Society, then you have the Barry Goldwater's defeat, and then you have inflation under the Carter years and sort of the economic malaise. Reagan enters the scene.
Right.
What does he do?
He had a simple program, didn't he? I mean, he cut taxes, and contrary to widespread predictions, inflation, which was in double digits when he came in, declined despite the tax reduction. Reagan, he cut taxes, and on the that essentially was his domestic policy, and I think he deserves credit for welfare reform too. But that was a case of working with the Democrats, and they got I think a substantial reform through, which was needed. I mean, I think LBJ was full of good intentions with the Great Society, but it really disincentivized a lot of people, and it did a lot of damage to poor families, especially poor African American families, where this has nothing to do with skin color.
Sure.
Anyone, and I'm not getting into that. Anyone who happens to be poor, a man, if he succeeds in impregnating a number of women, he gets part of the welfare benefits. And so you get paid for fornication. Well, that's not what LBJ meant.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, a lot of that happened. Anyway, I mean, I think parts of the Great Society were good, but parts hadn't been thought out properly. And I think that's what we've been trying to reform since both in Reagan's time, but also Bill Clinton as well. Some proper welfare reform there, I think. And on the foreign side, he built up the Defense Department, and he, as I said earlier in your meeting, he played poker. He saw the possibilities for the concept of a completely defensive but efficiently defensive anti-missile system. It's non-nuclear. It's entirely defensive. It's not an escalation. But guess what, you chaps in the Kremlin? You won't have any gun at our head anymore. Gorbachev was full of goodwill and tried to talk him out of it at Reykjavik and so on. But then the souffle collapsed. I mean, the Russians were spending 50% of their GDP on military matters, and they were afraid they would have no deterrent power. The Americans and the West generally could do what they wanted, and they couldn't say, well, blow you up, because if they said that, the Americans said, well, fine, we'll blow up your missiles in the sky, and the hell with you. So, it was a straight poker hand, really. And, the dirty little secret was we've never got we've made advances, certainly, but we never got a missile system that's leak-proof. Mm-hmm. I mean, the Pershing, do you remember the Pershing anti-missile missile?
I don't, but I'll
it was towed around in a truck, like a moving van. I mean, it was a brilliant idea. Yeah. You say. So you're driving around this thing in Germany, and it could be in outside Munich today, and 2 days from now at Hamburg or something. So the Russians would never know where the hell these things were, but they never really worked. But they scared the living Jehovah out of the Russians, but they did. They didn't really know where the missiles would land. But so it was a kind of a bluff, you see. And it worked. It worked perfectly. And I would claim, and I'm no great apologist for the current Russian government, but I would claim that even though it's an unsatisfactory and a far from democratic government, and obviously a terribly corrupt regime in Russia, that it's still better government than they were getting under communism. Mm-hmm. Sure. I believe that's true.
So looking at America in 2024, I think you could describe the American regime, as an oligarchy, right? I do think
America. An oligarchy. Johnny, as Margaret Thatcher used to say, do my ears deceive me?
So, I mean, I think there is essentially the permanent kind of bureaucratic class in DC that's sort of lodged in the administrative state.
Yeah.
Has, essentially formed, an alliance with, I guess I would say the elite classes, whether it's in Wall Street.
Yeah, I see. Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and Hollywood.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, and you can kind of seamlessly move from within the government to, adjacent to the government. And so regardless of, it's not that presidential elections are inconsequential. Obviously there's, from judicial appointments to foreign policy to other things, but largely there's this permanent bureaucratic class
that's they're all Democrats.
They're all Democrats.
You see the vote in DC, it's 95% Democrat.
And so in that sense, I think oftentimes when people are saying, we must defend American democracy, or democracy is on the ballot, right?
No, that's just rank hypocrisy.
It's hypocrisy. And whenever they say democracy, I replace it with oligarchy.
They mean that we don't want democracy.
They don't exactly right. So how do you effectively take this on without getting swallowed by the administrative state? And as we think about that, do we need a Reagan? Do we need an FDR? Do we need a Caesar? Do we need a Cicero? Right? Where should we be turning in this moment?
Look, it would be wonderful if you had, you don't want a Cicero. I'm sorry to interrupt myself, but he dabbled in politics and he wasn't good at it. He was a great orator and a great lawyer, although the law was a fairly primitive thing in those days. But he wasn't politically skillful. He got his signals crossed, and that's why, he, in the end, the smart move was not to oppose the Caesars when Julius and Octavian were there, and he did. And in a devious way too, and but it'd be nice if an American president had some of the better qualities of these ancient leaders. But just in this country, there's plenty of precedent for the sort of statesmanship that you need. I mean, it is one of the phenomena of the United States and its history that whenever you have a crisis that requires a really gifted leader, you get him, and it could be a woman next, but you get that person. And your system works. Is there something ineluctable about when you can live with the Joe Bidens and the Warren Hardings and the Franklin Pierces, you do. But when you have to have a Washington or a Lincoln or a Roosevelt, either Roosevelt, you get them. Even though, Lincoln was very underestimated when he came into office. Everyone east of the Mississippi thought he was just some yokel, and he only had one term in Congress, and they thought he was a folksy frontiersman who was too tall. And a lot of people, Walter Lippmann and these people who'd known him a long time, thought FDR was a bit of a lightweight, but he wasn't. I may cause you glottal stops, but I think the closest we've got to what is needed right now is Trump, because he has a formula for ending this rather cynical process of piling voting blocks on top of each other by buying them, and instead using traditional meritocratic capitalism to wean people away from the welfare state and into financing themselves through their own work, positive, irrespective of ideology or partisanship. Two, he has been so terribly wronged by that establishment in Washington, that bipartisan, the O'Bushingtons, I used to call them, yes, I put them all together there, since Reagan, really. And, they alternate the White House, and they alternate the Congress too, but they're always moving to the left, and Washington itself is entirely Democratic. And all of the civil servants are Democratic, practically. So Trump has been persecuted by them, and he believes, and there's some case to be made for this, despite the systematic denial of it in the media, that his last election was stolen. I mean, there were millions of harvested ballots where you couldn't verify if they were accurately cast or not. So, in an election where 50,000 votes in Pennsylvania and two other states, and he would have won. He will really seriously assault the phenomenon you talked about.
And so I think this is what I want to focus in here. So how, if you were, advising President Trump, and, we may be watching this after the election comes out, what advice would you give so that so Trump's first term, I think, was successful in many ways. Nixon's, presidency was successful in many ways, but it had a very tragic ending. They had similar enemies, the media, the deep state. So how would you advise a Trump, if he ends up going back in a second time, to avoid Nixon's fate and demise, to successfully
I think he knows it, and he means what he says when he says, "My revenge will be to govern well." And I think he is confident of the program he wants to put through. He will be able to put it through. And those who don't like him in the government, there's no doubt most of the employees of the U.S. I mean, I think the military like him, but the civilian employees of the U.S. government, most of them don't like him. I think they'll just have to grin and bear it and see that it's working for the country. Trump, they don't have to worry about him running again, because he can't run again. He's getting old anyway. And at a certain point, just remember, in the case of Reagan, the dread, it wasn't as bad as when Trump came in, but the horror, the absolute appalled, blank faces of all sorts of well-meaning people in Georgetown and on Fifth Avenue and Park Avenue and so on. This actor, as if it was some reprobate with a seat out of his trousers or something, coming into the White House, and by the end of it, everyone said, "Well, he seems like actually a nice guy, and it's actually worked out well."
Yeah.
Now, they're not going to say that they think Trump's a nice guy, but I think his program will work. It worked last time, and he'll be better at it this time, and have better people. He knows better how to choose people now, because he had no experience at it. He had no one helping him. The only member of the Senate in the Republican Party that supported him, I think, was Sessions. And he was a terrible attorney general, but a rather nice man, but not a good attorney general. But it's like anything else. The more you do it, the better you get at it. So he's learned a lot from what went wrong, and he'll just let success speak for itself. And the theory that it'll be to use a word quite current, a bloodbath, that he'll fire the whole civil service like Andrew Jackson or something. He's not going to do that, but you don't need to do that. You just have to make sure that the departments are run by people who are signed on to what you want and will accept responsibility for making sure that it happens.
Is there a way that we can actually get the heads of the agencies to be able to control the people that work in these agencies?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
I think, and every president, to some extent, has this problem. I mean, when, for example, after the evacuation in Dunkirk in 1940, the British and French soldiers got out, but most of them didn't have the rifles, and certainly they didn't have tanks and artillery and so on. So Roosevelt sent General Marshall, sort of frog marched him down to the Congress and said it would not damage American security if we parted with, he sent him 250,000 rifles and a huge amount of ammunition and I think over 1,000 artillery pieces, and he put them on American flag ships so they wouldn't be interfered with by the Germans. And then knowing government as he did, having been the deputy Navy secretary in World War I, he would have people at each stage of the process. So he'd phone them directly, you see. And if you're well down in the U.S. government, you get a call directly from the president himself. I mean, it's a startling thing for these people, And so he said, "Have we got to this stage yet?" No. I said, "Well, where are we?" He said, "Well, I'm waiting to hear from." So he would phone around, and he intervened in this process and went from person to person, saying, "Look, if that isn't done today, you won't have that job tomorrow." When Mr. Nixon went to Russia and the Soviet Union in 1972, a month after he came back from China, and the North Vietnamese offensive was still going on in Vietnam. He said, when that offensive started, he said, "All right, we're going to have 1,000 bombing raids per day on North Vietnam. And I don't want any bunk from any of you about the weather's bad or the pilots need R&R and Waikiki or something. This happens, and if it doesn't happen, I'm going to fire all of you." And then he, in that Nixonian way, went into a bit of a rage about how all most officers cared about was building a more luxurious officers' mess and having more privates to shine their boots and things. But he stayed on topic a bit. He said, "Look, this has to happen." And when he went to the USSR, he said, "We are raising it to 1,200 a day all the time I'm in Russia. I don't want anyone to be in any doubt about what we're doing here." And it worked. It worked. I mean, a country like North Vietnam can't take that amount of incoming from the air indefinitely. I mean, it's a pretty rickety country.
So we're about out of time. And to close, ISI's main mission, right, is educating, instilling character in the next generation of American leaders, where we want to create great men and great women.
Now, you have a lot of very bright, attractive young people here.
Thank you. No, that means a lot coming from you. As a biographer and a historian, I'm wondering, what advice do you have to try to inculcate, those virtues in the next generation? So some, Machiavelli, others recommend reading biographies, reading histories, right? So what is...
You want to be a little careful commending Machiavelli.
Well, I know. I qualify it. I'm generally a Machiavelli fan.
Oh, yeah.
With an asterisk, right?
No, he was tactically astute, but you want a little less cynicism, I think.
I'm not saying we turn to Machiavelli. I'm saying Machiavelli recommended the study of histories, right? That was kind of
no, he did.
So what would you say is what advice would you impart for ISI and for our students as we think about forming the next, Ronald Reagan?
People, if they're interested in becoming statesmen, they have to know a good deal more than most people do about history and geography.
Geography.
Because you want to know that the Russians are annoyed that they can't necessarily get out of the Black Sea. It's just various things that have been bugbears to different countries over the years, And and geography in a sense of who has resources. I mean, China has practically no resources, so they have to get it from somewhere, and the implications of this. And so if you can give them the basics and have them keep in mind that this is a great country, and people who become prominent in the government of this country can change the country and the world for the better. And what higher calling could there be than that? And it's also, of course, very fulfilling when as I said, I just come from downtown where President Biden was arriving with the Prime Minister of India. I mean, I wouldn't want this, but some people would think it's fabulous having 50 motorcycles in front of your car, and security men and bands playing "Hail to the Chief" every time you went into another room and things. But so there's an ego aspect, but the real thing is
public.
I hate to sound like such a Boy Scout here, but let's see if we can't make the world better.
Yeah.
And Ronald Reagan did.
Yeah. Well, on that note, we'll close. Thanks so much for joining, Conrad.
Not a bit. Thank you. Thanks for your invitation.
Yeah.